The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March 2023. Margaret Elaine Hoover, 71 years old, Harlan County, Kentucky, read it standing at her kitchen table. She did not sit down. The envelope had a logo she did not recognize: Keystone Agricultural Credit Solutions, a name that sounded like 4 words assembled by a committee to mean nothing in particular. The letter was 2 pages. The key lines were on page 1, a promissory note originating in 1987, a lien on 214 acres, a demand for $312,000 in principal, interest, and compounded fees. Payment required within 60 days. She set the letter on the table. She read it again. She looked out the window at the East Ridge, where the old limestone quarry her father had worked for 19 years sat quiet and still under a gray March sky. Then she went outside to check on the inoculation logs. Margaret Hoover had been farming the Harlan County land for 43 years. Her father, George Elias Hoover, had worked it before her and his father before him. When George died in November 2001, he left Margaret one instruction about the land. Not the house, not the equipment, not the mineral rights her cousins had spent 2 years arguing over. Just the land itself, and one instruction: keep the survey current. He had said this to her from a hospital bed with a clarity that surprised her, given the morphine. She had nodded. She had kept it. Margaret did not call a lawyer that Tuesday. She called her neighbor, Dottie Frazier, who had known her family since before Margaret was born, and she told Dottie what the letter said. Dottie asked if she needed company. Margaret said no. Then she went upstairs to find the cardboard tube her father had left on the shelf above the hot water heater. To understand what Margaret Hoover built on 214 acres of Harlan County land, it helps to understand the land itself. The eastern 67 acres had been quarried for limestone from 1952 to 1971. When the deposit thinned and the company that owned the rights moved its operations north to Bell County, what they left behind was a landscape that no one wanted: irregular topography, depressions 8 to 14 feet deep that collected water, exposed rock faces on 3 sides, and soil chemistry that conventional farmers said was ruined for anything that needed a pH above 5, too. George Hoover's neighbors said so directly. They said it at the feed store. They said it at the Harlan County Agricultural Extension Office, where a young agent in 1979 put a red pen through the eastern acreage on a map and wrote the word marginal in the margin. George Hoover kept the land anyway. He kept it because his father had kept it, and because he did not believe the word marginal meant the same thing as worthless. He paid the county taxes on it every year, $847 to $1,140 depending on the assessment cycle, without exception. He used the western 147 acres for tobacco through the 1980s, then for hay through the 1990s, and when his health began failing in 1998, he leased those acres to a neighboring operation for $2,400 a year. The eastern quarry acres he left alone. He watched them. He took notes. Margaret had watched him do it. She was 28 when she came home from Morehead State to help her mother after a bad winter, and she was still there when the lease ran out. And George's health required more than her mother could manage alone. She had intended to stay 1 year. She had stayed 43. She wore the same waterproof boots to the field that she had worn for 20 years, resold twice at the shop in Harlan City. She drove a 2004 pickup that had 214,000 miles on it. She had never taken a vacation that lasted more than 4 days, and those 4 days were in Gatlinburg in 2009 for her nephew's wedding. What George Hoover had noticed about the eastern quarry acres, and what he wrote in a composition notebook he kept on the shelf above the hot water heater alongside the cardboard tube, was that the depressions held moisture at a rate the surrounding land did not. The rock faces created microclimates, pockets of humidity and stable temperature that persisted through the dry months of July and August, when the rest of Harlan County was cracked and brown. He had found wild chanterelles in those depressions in 1963, 1971, 1978, 1982, 1984, and 1989. He wrote the dates down. He wrote the locations. He wrote the approximate weights of what he harvested. He did not know what to do with the information. He was a tobacco farmer. But he wrote it down anyway. Margaret read the notebook in 2003, 2 years after her father died. She had a library card at the Harlan County Public Library. She had an email address. She spent 14 months reading everything she could find about mycology, inoculation methods, substrate preparation, and the commercial cultivation of specialty fungi. In June 2004, she ordered her first inoculation kit from a supplier in Oregon. She used 3 of her father's depression sites. She used them because the notebook told her where they were. By 2008, she had inoculated 22 sites. By 2012, she had 41. By 2019, Hoover Quarry Mushrooms was supplying lion's mane, maitake, hen of the woods, and black trumpet varieties to 7 restaurant accounts in Lexington, 3 in Nashville, and a specialty grocer in Cincinnati. Her annual revenue in 2022 was $287,000. Her net margin was 61%. She had never taken out a business loan. She had never borrowed against the land. No one had ever suggested she had to. Tyler Greer was 33 years old. He had an MBA from the University of Pittsburgh and had joined Keystone Agricultural Credit Solutions in January 2022 as a regional portfolio manager for what the firm's internal documents called legacy agricultural debt instruments, a phrase that meant old notes that had sat in acquired portfolios for years without resolution. His performance bonus was tied to a quarterly recovery rate. His predecessor in the role had recovered under $4 million in the first 2 quarters of the year. Tyler Greer intended to recover more. His process was efficient. He had access to county deed databases in 6 southeastern states. He ran keyword searches for properties with attached instruments from the 1980s and 1990s, where the originating lender had been absorbed through acquisition, where the instrument had never been formally discharged, and where the current property owner appeared to lack the legal resources to mount a challenge. He worked from a spreadsheet. He sorted it by age of instrument and estimated property value. Margaret Hoover appeared on the spreadsheet on a Friday afternoon in February 2023. Tyler Greer spent 14 minutes reviewing her file. He found a promissory note from 1987, signed by her father, with Appalachian Federal Savings as the originating lender. Appalachian Federal had been acquired by 3 subsequent institutions. The note had passed through all 3 acquisitions without formal discharge because, in the opinion of Keystone's outside counsel, no party had possessed the original documentation necessary to close it out. Keystone had acquired a portfolio containing the instrument in 2021. Tyler Greer's interpretation was that the note remained active. He sent the letter on March 7, 2023. He had 11 other letters going out that week. Margaret Hoover's was not the first. She was not the last. She was number 7 on his list that quarter. He told 2 colleagues at lunch that the Harlan County one was going to be easy. The land looked like nothing. He had pulled satellite imagery, old quarry, some kind of farm operation, hard to tell exactly what. He said the woman was 71. He said it should wrap up in 30 days. His colleagues did not disagree. Nobody sitting at that table had ever been to Harlan County, Kentucky. The cardboard tube had been on the shelf above the hot water heater since 1987. George Hoover had put it there after the county resurveyed the area following a boundary dispute with the adjacent property to the northeast. He had paid $100 for the survey. He had kept the original in the tube and filed a copy with the county recorder's office in Harlan. He told Margaret about it in 2001 from the hospital bed. She had nodded. She had not thought about it again until the Tuesday the letter arrived. She climbed the stairs to the second floor. She opened the closet with the water heater. The tube was where it had always been. A gray cardboard tube, 34 inches long, sealed at both ends with plastic caps that had yellowed. Her father's handwriting on a strip of masking tape along the side. Survey, E, 67 acres, 1987, K. Rupert, licensed surveyor. She carried it downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table. She pulled the cap off one end. The document inside had been rolled for 36 years. She unrolled it carefully, using 4 coffee mugs to hold the corners flat on the kitchen table. The survey was hand-drafted on linen paper. K. Rupert had done his work by hand, in ink, with a precision that showed in every line. The boundaries of the eastern 67 acres were drawn in blue. Annotated in a surveyor's script, Margaret had to lean close to read. The quarry depressions were marked. The rock faces were indicated. The access road was drawn from the county line. On the lower left corner of the survey, in a box labeled Lien Instruments, Cross-Reference, Rupert had noted 2 items. The first was the 1987 promissory note with Appalachian Federal Savings. The second was a discharge notation, referencing a separate instrument dated September 14, 1994. The notation read, Instrument number 944471, Harlan County Recorder's Office. Original note marked Satisfied. See recorded discharge. Margaret sat with the survey for a long time. She read the notation 3 times. Then she found a lawyer. His name was Martin Falk. He had practiced in Harlan County for 31 years and kept an office above a tax preparation firm on Central Street. He was 62, and he had seen versions of this kind of case before. Not often, but enough to know that the cases that looked simple usually weren't, and that the cases that looked impossible sometimes had a piece of paper somewhere that changed everything. He looked at the survey. He looked at the cross-reference notation. He said, "Let me pull the county records before we say anything definitive." He said he had seen discharge notations that turned out to be clerical references with no substance behind them. He pulled the records the next day. Instrument number 94-4471 was there. It was a formal discharge of the 1987 promissory note, executed by Appalachian Federal Savings Successor Institution at the time, recorded with the Harlan County Clerk on September 14, 1994. The original note had been paid in full in August 1994, 29 years before Tyler Greer sent his letter. The discharge had been recorded. It had a stamp. It had a signature. It had a docket number. Martin Falk called Margaret Hoover that afternoon. He told her what he had found. He said, the note was discharged in 1994. He said, the survey cross-referenced the discharge. He said, your father knew about this. He had it documented. Margaret said she knew. She said her father wrote things down. Martin Falk filed a single response document with Keystone Agricultural Credit Solutions Legal Counsel on April 4, 2023. The document was 7 pages. It included a copy of instrument number 94-4471. It included the survey cross-reference. It included a certified copy from the Harlan County Clerk's records showing the date and docket number of the original recording. It included a demand for all costs incurred, all attorney's fees, and damages under Kentucky's Consumer Protection Act for the knowing pursuit of a discharged instrument. Keystone's legal counsel called Martin Falk's office on April 7, 2023. That was 72 hours after the filing. Martin Falk said later that 72 hours was all he needed to know. When a firm that sent a demand letter waits 60 days for a response, but calls back in 72 hours after the response arrives, they already know what their documents say. They have always known. The formal withdrawal letter arrived April 14, 2023. It acknowledged the recorded discharge. It withdrew all claims against Margaret Elaine Hoover and the 214 acres of Harlan County land. It was accompanied by a check for $41,200, which represented Margaret's legal fees, filing costs, and statutory damages under Kentucky's Consumer Protection Statute. There was no courtroom. There was no judge. There was one survey, one discharge instrument, and one notation in a surveyor's handwriting from 1987 that George Hoover had kept on a shelf above a water heater for 36 years because he believed in keeping things where you could find them. On the morning of April 15, 2023, Margaret Hoover drove to the East Ridge. She parked the truck at the top of the access road and walked down through the first row of inoculation logs to the place where her father was buried. A small stone marker at the edge of Depression Number 3, the largest of the moisture-holding depressions, the one that had given the highest yields in 9 of the last 11 years. Her mother was buried there too, next to George, under a red maple that had seeded itself in the depression sometime in the 1990s and grown to 40 feet without anyone planting it. She stood there for a while. She did not hurry. The morning was cold and the air smelled like limestone and wet earth, the way the East Ridge always smelled in April. A hen of the woods cluster had come up overnight near the base of the maple. She would harvest it that afternoon. She said to the stone, "You knew where the paper was. You always knew where the paper was." Then she turned and walked back up through the inoculation logs toward the truck. The logs were doing well. The season was starting. She had 14 restaurant accounts now. She had a waiting list. Some land looks like nothing because the people looking don't know what they're looking for. George Hoover had known. He had written it down in a composition notebook and rolled a survey into a cardboard tube and put it on a shelf above a water heater in 1987. And he had left one instruction to the person he trusted to keep the land. She had kept it. She had kept all of it. That is the kind of knowledge that doesn't transfer to a spreadsheet. It doesn't show up in satellite imagery. It doesn't get found in 14 minutes on a Friday afternoon by someone sorting a list. It lives in the paper. It lives in the land. And it waits, patient as limestone, for the moment it's needed. Stories like this one exist because someone refused to let the land go without a fight. Subscribe to Acre Stories, and we'll make sure they keep getting told. Next time, a 74-year-old cattle farmer in Decatur County, Tennessee, receives a notice that an easement running through the center of his property was never legally granted. And the company that built a road through his land 22 years ago is about to find out what he has in a safety deposit box in Decatur. We'll see you there.